Okay, if you're watching this or you're listening to this, welcome to Outside of the Colony podcast. My name is Bernard Sweeney. I'm an Irish traveller and I'm based in the northwest of Ireland in a place called Sligo. Also, my co-host, Dylan Foley, archaeologist among other skills and traits, also in the northwest of the island and also in Sligo. And Dylan is a 20-year in the field archaeologist, but I'm sure he's going to tell you all about that in a moment and how tough and how rough the poor archaeologists have it all over Ireland. And he's told me this on many occasions that they're probably worsely treated than the poor travellers. But we'll ask Aina in a moment, our guest, because she's also an archaeologist and anthropologist, I think, if I got that right. And she had written a paper in, well, it begins with 2015, it was released. Is that correct?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah, and the name of the paper was The Making of the Irish Traveller Community, Mobility, Discourse, Settlement Policies, and the Irish State, 1950 to 2010. And as we say, outside the colony, what it means to me is thinking outside the box, outside of colonial labels. We come from a culture that's old enough to know that racism and fascism and all of these distinctions came from a colonial origins. So therefore, if you wanted to be indigenous and native, then you can't be racist or fascist because there are colonial labels. Thought I'd mention that because I don't want our podcast to get misunderstood when we talk about history and colonization. This is not about going over old scores. It's about what is relevant in the present, and what's in the present are historical grievances. I am hoping that added with the island's history of overcoming many physical conflicts and violence, that we would now add and apply a peace of mind and a healing process. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Ina, our guest. Thank you very much for coming on. We hope to learn quite a bit about this paper and yourself. So take as long as you want, introduce yourself as long as you like, and tell us as much as you can.
Hi, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Um, this paper, it feels like a long time ago that I wrote it, but it's something that keeps coming back to me as a topic, not just the Irish traveller community, but just Indigenous groups and minority groups in themselves. I'm currently based in Norway. I work at an international school, so I see children from all sorts of different cultures, with different backgrounds, and it's a topic that comes up a lot of how do we coexist together in this world. Um, my background is in archaeology and anthropology, as you mentioned. I studied that, and I spent some time also working in archaeology. As you mentioned, it's a tough tough job. So for the moment, I've moved out of that field. But the anthropology side of it, continues strong for me. And I feel like in the education field, we have a really important job to do to talk about these issues, which might seem in a way really complicated. If you read these sorts of papers, we have complicated language and terminology, and as you say, colonial terminology. But actually, at the heart of it is often a feeling and personal experiences. And this is something that actually children are very well able to identify and talk about, and that we can also learn a lot from and think maybe outside also of the academic paradigm, but really see this as a real lived experience. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk more about, the work you're doing and your experience and sort of how we all came to this. And also some of the parallels that we can maybe draw with things that are happening in Ireland and around the world at the moment.
Absolutely. I look forward to that. We call it a meeting of the minds, thinking outside
Yeah,
the box, thinking
yeah,
outside the colony, where we leave all them labels in there for the time being. We know them because we use them, but they don't have the same meaning or definitions. So it gives a kind of a stand back perspective. And we're free from all the labels, traveller, settled, white, black, brown, all of it, just for the time being. Of course, we have to snap back to reality and go into our roles and our disciplines and rely on that expertise. But I do believe we can always take that a step back. That's not beyond our imagination. I'll hand you over to Dylan. He can introduce himself, and yeah, we'll start talking about your paper.
Hello, Dylan Foley is my name. I'm an archaeologist, as Bernard said, or I was a field archaeologist for quite a few years, as Bernard said. I haven't dug in a while now, I'm going to have to admit. As you get older, it gets a bit harder. But in relation to this kind of thing, I think that when I work with Bernard, I'm from the same town, so we see many things in the world in a similar way, even though we're from slightly different communities. And I suppose, which we're breaking down here, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, archaeology is an interesting one. We used to have that question, wasn't it? Why would archaeologists or anthropologists be involved in things that were sociological problems or that kind of problem, that kind of thing? We've been asked that question a couple of times. But in Ireland, like a lot of places, but it's particularly in Ireland, in Western Europe, the history of it is quite long, of colonization and the problems that emerged from it. So we kind of thought that, like, a lot of the discourse about the state and travelers and all that kind of stuff, if you were lucky, it would go back to this maybe 50s or 60s. A lot of it wouldn't go back to 1922, and definitely wouldn't go back much further than that. Maybe to the famine at most, if you know what I mean, in my experience. But we try to work on it like try to incorporate everything possible in the most general terms possible kind of thing. So we might not end up being experts on any particular thing, but we try to integrate information from as many sources as possible, and also step back and have a wider view, as we know that a lot of the problems in Ireland go back at least, well, we could choose any amount of time, but let's say 400 or 500 years back to the 16th century is where we usually concentrate on, to sort of see where the source of these problems are. Yeah, and we find we're making some progress. That's that's where I'm involved with this kind of thing.
Very good.
Yeah.
First question I suppose is the title of your paper. It says "The Making of the Irish Traveller Community and Mobility Discourse, Settlement Policies, and the Irish State." That's quite a loaded title. What do you mean by the making of the traveller community?
Yeah, we talked for a long time actually about the title, and I felt quite adamant that making or creation or something like this was important, because um, I felt, as I was looking through the different ways of defining community, or you look at origin stories, which are usually some rooted in some sorts of historic events or myths, um, you come to the realization that actually quite a lot of effort was put in the early years of the Irish state to create this community, and not necessarily from within the community. You can really see an effort to somehow define, for whatever goal that was, whether it was you know for positive, negative, whatever reasons. There was this push to somehow define people of who they were. For me, the analogy is similar to if there's a football match. If we're talking, in international games, when Ireland's playing, we're all Irish. But if it's internal, then you're maybe from Cork, or you're from Dublin, or wherever it is, and then you go more local, and again you redefine yourself. So it almost feels like with Irish independence, prior to, it felt, okay, we are Irish, we are fighting the colonial power. And then once that hurdle perhaps was removed, at least seemingly removed, to try to redefine, okay, well, who are we amongst ourselves now? And there, that making of the community, very much with detrimental effects, because it was often or almost exclusively without input from that community itself, was used as a tool for defining class, for defining status, for defining identity. So it was not something that was really informed by history, but created by history, and quite intentionally so. And I feel like that's a narrative that is often not discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we go into the 60s, because that comes up in the 60s, particularly in the Commission report on itinerancy, where it was almost a semi-exclusion of historians. They had everybody else at the table except for historians. So they didn't want to know the history in the 60s. But did you get a sense of what the environment was like in the 1950s? Now, there was a lot of poverty. It was a couple of years after World War II. It was the beginning of the mother baby homes, also, I believe. So there was a lot of poverty, particularly and always beyond the pale, you could say, particularly the west of Ireland and places like this. So even distinctions were made at that time. There might be very thin line because it would have been covered over with poverty, anyways. But can you tell me about what was the relationship between these people that were called either travelers, thinkers, or itinerants and the general population? Because my sense is that it was nothing like post 1960. It was probably more communal, and that could have been too also down to economical status and so on and so forth.
Again, it's hard to know what, the grassroots feeling really was, because there is not an awful lot of documentation of that. But what it seems to me from reading more, I guess, the official documentation, is that it's almost with blanket poverty, post World War II, having participated but not really participated, and finding themselves in that position on the edge of Europe. um, it's almost trying to create a class system within a system of poverty, create some sort of ranking within everyone suffering, um, to, even if you look at writers like Bourdieu, everybody wants to feel slightly above of the other. You always aspire to, I guess, just slightly above your abilities or your means. Um, so I guess it almost uses a tool for people to, rather than focusing on their own struggles, their own poverty, to actually create divisions within communities, and thereby take focus away from what really the whole country was struggling with. And I mean, you mentioned the West being particularly affected, and I mean, that goes back hundreds of years. I mean, you have to Heller to Connacht. I mean, there's a consistent um, sort of definition of the West as poor. And these definitions, I think, were just entrenched even further in this time.
Yeah, I will hand it over to Dylan. He might give a little bit of a framework to the previous maybe state building or nation building or even historical context. Um, but just on the 1950s, I guess there was a certain tension because there was a kind of a recognition even prior to that about a distinct culture, and you would have found that through the Yeats brothers, where even William Yeats believed these people were part of the old Gaelic chieftain clans. There was a lady, Augustus Margaret. There was O'Neill, who had romanticized these cultures pre-Gaels leading up to the 1916 uprising. So for me, the making of these people, I'm not sure it happened like that. Because if we reversed it right around to a 360, we would say that, well, we've been here travelers, we've been called thinkers, we've been called itinerants, we've been called wild Irish, we've been called a lot of labels going back hundreds of years. The question we would be asking is that who are you people? As in, where did you get your systems from? Where did you get your foundation from? Where did you get your institutions from? Where did you get your language from? Why are you using the gay or the English labels and attitudes towards Irish people? So that was the part I think was always missing from that as we spoke. But yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Dylan and he might give a little bit on, well, the framework of colonization that got people to your report and onwards. And I think also then it gives people sort of a context to put what we're saying into a context. If we can give a kind of an overarching story from up to that point, maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it's straightforward. The history before that, I mean, nothing straightforward about history, obviously, but in a way, the outline of the story is quite straightforward in the sense that it is really interesting what Ina's saying there about the state having to construct an identity, or this being very obvious in the you know, with the new state wanting to differentiate or make those classes, and travelers are going to be in a certain area, or they're going to define themselves against something. They need to define themselves against something, and this is going to be it. Although I would say that we look at it that in 1922, after they kind of got to be a free state, as Bernard and me have talked about many times, there was an element there of keeping all this. Firstly, the state is not. There was no fresh start for a start from the colonial era in 1920s until the Free State and then the Republic. There's very little in the way of a fresh start. There's no change of capital. There's no change of civil service. There's no real change of law. Even things like the Vagrancy Acts and many other. In fact, the entire body of law, pretty much 100% of it, was specifically kept by the treaty. So there was no real changeover in that respect. There was a change of like names and things, as we know, to some extent. But it lifts away the kind of top layer, which is the British administration from Westminster. And I guess that what we would say is that the state in Ireland probably had always defined itself against something in Ireland. That was what we were talking about, these elements of nomadism, or the cultures beyond, as Bernard had said, beyond the pale. If we were to, you know, the further you go back into the history, if you go back to, as we would say, to any time of the 14th, 15th, 16th century, the Irish state is descended from the Pale, from that state that was regarded as the Pale, which was basically just Dublin County. And at that time, what were English colonists that become a form of Irish culture, but it descended from the English colonists in Ireland. And they're mostly in the towns, so Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Kilkenny, all of these walled cities. The urban culture in Ireland, the culture of the law of the Pale, the system of law, the system of government, the courts, all of that develops over many centuries is actually this one that carries through from all the way through our story right into the Irish Free State. And what's interesting about that is that a conflict, maybe one way to look at it would be that when the conquest happens in the 17th century and Britain is directly administered in Ireland, more or less, it kind of subsumes conflicts of identity within the country between the old settlers from the 12th century in Dublin and in other parts of the country that had one system of law, the English common law, and that the kind of system, and the majority culture at the time, which was the Gaelic world right across most of the island, from the north, in the northwest, and even in Wicklow, as close as that in Dublin. So what we can say is in the 1920s, when the English colonies lifted, the Republic, what you might see to some extent is the re-emergence of an old conflict over identity, over who's really Irish and who's the real Irish in this situation. And because the upper hand is held by the law of the Pale, this is the first time in a way that Dublin finds itself in control of the country without its master in Westminster. If you think about it as a colonial capital or a colonial outpost, it's really the first time in centuries and centuries, in fact ever, that it's really had to govern without being administered itself from Westminster. And now it has to think, well, we're now Irish, we're the normal, so we must be we have to be the normal Irish. We have to have the identity that's the one that's the normal one the state is going to be built out of to get stability. And to get that identity, we're going to have to define ourselves against something. And actually, by that stage, the majority culture in the island was nominally, after centuries of English occupation and cultural interchange, let's say, more or less had been, a lot of the Gaelic world had been basically wiped out during the famine, especially. And it's recent enough history where it collapses in the West, if you know what I mean, and all that kind of thing. And they take on the mantle of creating a new state, a new Irish identity. But travellers never get included in that. They're there as that other that Ina's talking about. They're there. They become. It's almost necessary. And I guess you might want to know more about how that works after 1950, because it's interesting to people. Why does that reemerge, or why does that happen? Now, from our point of view in the long picture, it's not that unusual, because actually, if you go as you step back in time, you find that the Pale always had that attitude about Irish outside thing. It always complained they were nomadic, and always complained that they were savages, always complained they couldn't, you know, and it takes different forms over the centuries. But we would think that by 1963, that the state has taken on, the state is just repeating something similar. I don't know if maybe that's what maybe you can comment on that kind of thing or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think states always look for stability and how they can build that. Um, and as counterintuitive as it might seem, stability comes from people holding together, and that holding together is usually against some sort of force. You know, we see that in, you know, if you look at the start of the world wars in Germany, how is that sense of togetherness built? It is built off of we are together without these people. Um, and it really goes against the idea of togetherness, but a strong, at least in a nation state sense, togetherness is often built on otherness. We see that in the world today. If we look at, you know, discussions about refugees, or if we look at the Middle East, it's a continuous discussion of who is other, who are we. And if you look at, I mean, what you've just talked through, Dylan, I mean, it's such a long history of grappling with, you know, power between the so-called Irish and the British, but again, who is who is Irish, right? But that question was not so deeply analyzed when there was this bigger opposing force, which was the British Empire. And then once that seemingly falls away, although, as you say, of course, the institutions, the underlying system remains, but it falls away in the discourse, the conflict, the struggle has ended in a sense. You then need to find some way of unifying, because people will always look for a way of, you know, who are we, what defines us, and it's very difficult actually to do that without comparison. Even if you try it on a personal basis, how can you define yourself without using terminology or descriptions that specifically show how you are different from somebody else? And I feel like that just got stronger and stronger over the years, first in discourse, and then, of course, also in, you know, in the way the administration actually, you know, made laws and systematically made those two categories. But I think what you mentioned, you know, in terms of going back in time, if we look at, let's say, the wave of agriculture across Europe, I mean, we are all colonizers in a way. You know, and where in history can you say is the starting point of, well, this is who is British, this is who is Irish. We all have a nomadic history if we go far enough back. And then you look into the present and you look at trends like, you know, digital nomads, for example. It's you know, it's in our rhetoric, it's in our society, and it's just painted in different ways depending on who benefits from painting those pictures.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because we'd come up before, hadn't it, Bernard, about even in the 16th and 17th century, it's a similar discourse, but it's set in a different term. The idea then is that nomadism is they're reading classical authors, and the idea is that Rome is civilized, and outside of Rome is the nomads. And if they're nomads, then the Roman laws apply that they don't own land, they don't have permanent dwellings, and therefore the land is open to colonization, and this is all legal. And, you know, so there was a real motivation at that time to prove that people were even more nomadic than they were. Or if they did have a permanent house, knock it down and then declare them nomadic. It didn't really matter how it was done. But the idea was that this would make it legal because it would stand up in Roman law, or in the authors they were imitating. They were imitating the Roman colonies, that kind of thing. We're bringing civilization, that's kind of idea. So it gets very much, it gets embedded because, as you said, the whole concept, of course, is that you're defining something, but you're also it's to make a historical argument for what you're really doing anyway, which is appropriating the land, or you know, if you want to steal the mines or you want to take the cattle or whatever, you're colonizing the country at that stage. What's telling about this and what's interesting is in 1960s, the fact that they're so careful to avoid history, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because it tells you something in itself, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's also you see the switches so quick from the 50s where we're still sort of playing with the romanticizing idea. We're looking at, okay, what is our ancestry? Are we preserving some archaic lifestyle? They're not sure what they want to do with it. They know there is power in this discourse. They know there's power in defining communities and identity at this point. Um, and then I feel like with the whole De Valera era, it starts to solidify into something more and more negative and more systematic. But I think maybe that avoidance with history is because that switch was happening so rapidly. Um, and you kind of want to cover up the fact that that you were maybe uncertain or that there were different arguments being thrown around, and then you move more towards sort of a poverty class um, conversation, and you want to blanket that you were talking about this in a more romantic sense before. And in that sense, people's historic memories can be very short. We see that today as well. It's very easy to make a rhetorical U-turn. People debate about it for a little while, but then all of a sudden the new rhetoric just becomes solidified and people just go along with that.
And it's also kind of a very delicate operation to carry out in the first place because anything to do with history has something to do with trauma, maybe conflicts and re-emerging feelings and whatnot. So sometimes history sometimes to be best left alone. So we're not them kind of historians that want to talk about the past for the sake of talking about the past, because we would see this playing out in the present. Like I grew up being segregated and called thinker and itinerant. We grew up being taught we had no history. We didn't even come from the island. They had convinced some organizations so much that they thought we were Roma and Gypsies. So, and from the 60s, that's why I was asking about prior and leading up to that, because there was a sense of more communal acceptance of whoever was under a different kind of environment. Post 1960s, it seemed to get very institutionalized. A lot of segregation started to begin. And also the broadcasting over the airwaves and the national media during the 60s about this terms and references of a group and the presence of itinerants and the language and the metaphors that was used in the 60s about protecting the settled people and their presence and encouraging the guards to use every discipline and law possible to their no ends to do something with these people. So for me, there was always that kind of over and back recognition that there was two different groups, two different forces. Now, if we are to be assimilated at a young age and the systems were nicer to us, well, we wouldn't probably have recognized it. We would have grown up in a different mentality with a different outlook. But the fact that there were external forces and they were discriminatory reminded us constantly there is them and there is us. So it kept that divide going. Now, when we take a step back from all of that and we apply some science, like the geneticists, and he would say there was a divergence. Now, they have the narrative where there was a divergence from the settled population. But we know through archaeology there was no settled population at that time apart from Dublin, Galway, and the rest was Gaelic societies. So in theory, it would make more sense that the settled people were assimilated from being Gaels, particularly through the surrender and regrant process centuries ago, where they had to grow up inside an English school of thought. So that became their normal. And now I'm kind of ranting into all kinds of things, but I guess I'm trying to bring it back to the science to say that once this was all theory based and it could have been contested, and we were told to go away so many times, we didn't wait for the science to come along to tell a story. We've been telling this story for decades and centuries, where we came from, how we got here. So one science tells us there was a divergence 360 to 420 years ago. Then the microbiome comes along and says there has been a divergence several centuries back between the travelers and the settled. But they are telling us that our ancestral microbiome is ancient. It's one of the most unique on the planet. It comes from a pre-industrial world. He said it's the same one my ancestors might have had X amount centuries ago. So we maintain the science that backs the narrative, that backs the divergence, that backs the microbiome. When we say that we are not from this reality, we're telling the people that they have it all backwards. We are not the others. We're not the outsiders. We're not the ones who are different. It is they who've absorbed into an English school of thought through the unchanged institutions and the systems and the names and the labels. It's quite extraordinary to today that we've got young children killing themselves young as 9 years old because everybody's telling them that they're either traveller, Roma, ethnic, they're this group, they're that group, and nobody can come forward and tell us to clear it up. And we're saying that we can do that because we come with an origin story to start with. We've been saying this continuously, and now we're backing with science. But unfortunately, that is a bit of a shock to the system because it comes back to belief systems. If the state had created this national identity and they believed with all best intentions that they were the default Irish and they were the normal Irish and we were not. But the missing part of all of that is that the narrative just doesn't fit. How can you be the people you say you are without ever leaving the foundation of colonization? How can you say you are the indigenous and the native if you've never left the school of thought of the colonizers? So that's where we're at. I'm sorry for that rant, but yeah, I think we're trying to create that balance. It's complex because in the physical world, there's been a lot of improvements with technology and science and all of that. We see that. That's relevant. But psychologically, and we've got the stats to show for this for the last 60 years, that psychologically things were getting worse while physically getting better. So it came down to narratives. It came down to psychology. That if you keep telling people they're this, that, or the other when it's not true, it's going to have profound effects on their worldview, I guess. That brings me into the 1960s, and you can comment and interrupt any time and ask any questions yourself. The 1960s kind of aligns what we're saying. It's now they become very protective of the state. We already mentioned about being protective of the settled people, and it was about property and it was about land, and they start referencing the 1824 Act, which was an English act, and they start referencing the 1847 Act, which is a strange act in itself because that's right in the middle of a famine. That's when millions and thousands of people suffered, and that act was written. So they were referenced that in the 1960s as if somehow or another they were in the same school of thought. And they were looking out at travellers in the same way the English used to look on their ancestors. Because travellers, thinkers, itinerants, and nomads are all colonial labels. They didn't come from a Gaelic world, they came with the English colonisers. And they have an origin around the time there was a divergence, around the time the microbiome said there was a split. So, yeah, the 1960s, did you sense the state were kind of, you actually said this, which I found interesting. It was like, on one hand, they were presenting this as a assimilation, that they were going to, this was for our own good, but we did not know it. In actual fact, we didn't even need to know about it because they were going to steal up on us and ask us a lot of strange kind of questions. But they were going to assimilate us on one hand. It was going to be really good for everyone. Then on the other hand, you were saying in your papers, like they were holding us at arm's length at the same time. And this had to do with they were trying to work out who they are if we are who we say we are. Was that something you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, that was very much my sense that the public official rhetoric is one of assimilation. Um, let's say help these people, be more like us, we'll be one group together. But if you look at the nitty-gritty of all the rules, it was completely the opposite. It was suggesting assimilation, but making assimilation essentially impossible. It seemed deliberate, which, in retrospect is a good thing, that it wasn't just, used to essentially, drive out a whole culture, a whole group, a whole identity. But the intention behind it was certainly not a good one. Maintaining a marginalized group as a tool, really, sort of creating the antithesis of what you want as a nation state, so that everyone can pin these labels, can put all these negative thoughts on a group. And it is a small group. I mean, if you look at the percentage within compared to the settled population, it was unfortunately a very easy group to target. And it was very much framed just in response to what you're saying, like looking at the science, at this time it was framed as their nomadic lifestyle was a reaction to poverty. So it stemmed from poverty, and this was an expression of poverty rather than, the nomadic lifestyle was an underlying trait, and the poverty was something that was thrown on top of everyone at a certain point. Um, so definitely it was reversed. And what you mentioned about the facts versus psychology, I feel like this plays into this, and it plays into the present day. Um, the facts are there and you can have as many facts as you want, but the feeling that this discourse created that sticks around, and it sticks deeper and it sticks longer than presenting facts. And it is also because when you pit people against each other, you put them in separate groups. Um, Going back on that and saying, actually, no, that was wrong, or we have now facts that say that was wrong. Um, it's it's a psychologically difficult thing to do for people to change that mindset. You mentioned growing up with this. Um, it's something that's so deeply ingrained. Um, in people who think about this in these terms of colonialism and history, but also in those who have, given very little thought to it. That it is a part of what we hear throughout our schooling, our experiences through life. And it's very difficult to unsettle that image, to break that narrative. And actually, this was a question I had for you because I've been, out of the Irish school system for some time. But is this discourse and the identity of travelers, is that something that is now talked about in schools? Is it an open topic? Is it something that young people actually engage with?
which is a kind of a follow-on from 1963 where there was no travellers included. Well, then they created another system where travellers would be handpicked by settled people. So if you were deserving or undeserving, the settled people, and they've been there for the last 50 years, and some of these people teach human rights and community development principles, which is about collectivism and working where people are at, but they've never given up their own title inside the organization.
Mm.
So it's not their fault, because just like the good old Christians kicking the crap out of Fred because they thought the devil was in him, they believed it, and they believe it right this present moment. They are doing the right thing. But it's not in the education system because it isn't in the NGOs either at the moment, in a way that it's understandable, because they have myths like we have no written history. We lived on the fringes of society. We had no engagement with Irish history, that somehow or another we're so separated as one group throughout hundreds of years as one group. When we know, and when every traveller in the country is still saying that's not our narrative, we're not saying that at all. We respect we come from clans, we come from locations and areas. So that narrative has to be fixed with the support groups who, of course, like other people, didn't have the science at the time. Now, all the narrative was there, the community knowledge was there. Nan Joyce was saying it, Michael McDonough was saying it. All these travellers up and down the country over the decades had been saying pretty much the same story. That we've been here, that Irish history is traveller history and traveller history is Irish history. And we weren't always called travellers, we were called thinkers and we were called itinerants. That doesn't mean the culture and the ethnicity wasn't there, because the science shows up again, even 1,000 years ago, there was genetic markers. And that comes from clans intermarrying with other clans and so on and so forth. This is not to romanticize it, because we're not believing in living in the past. That's nonsense. We live in the now. But I think if we can change the current narrative, it would change the institutions, which would change the systems, which would change the outcomes for travellers. Because at the present moment, as I mentioned, children getting killed and taking their lives because they're getting bullied over their ethnicity, when we think it's quite simple to explain it. But no, not a sorry.
There is some recognition, though, of, I mean, even with the work you've done yourself, Bernard, and some of our discussions with I think St. Mary's, the teacher training colleges in Limerick, Santee Corcoran, and various others like that have done work on getting the curriculum, because at the moment there is a law coming for a curriculum change that would allow for travel, what they're calling traveller history, but the state hasn't defined what that is. And now, of course, the The problem is the lack of material, the lack of any narrative that is coherent about travelers or any of this history. So they're not sure now what to teach. And there was actually a call in one of the documents. Do you remember the document, Bernard? The
2018 Traveller History and Education, I believe.
Yeah, so there's calls in that for historians and for others to step in and actually start. They're not sure what they should be teaching as such, if you know what I mean. So it's
Because
now
I think that's key, because I feel like this is the area where you can make the biggest step forward, but it is how that is handled. And again, who is the one who writes the history? Who has input? Do we teach it as history? Do we teach it, how do we do this? And in Norway, we have a very similar situation. We've got our colonial history with Denmark, and we have the Sami people who live across the Scandinavian states. And we have a very similar situation here where the narrative has run, in certain directions, and that othering has happened. And as you just mentioned, it's become a compulsory part of curriculum, but nobody has specifically defined what it is we teach. And the effect of that is you teach about, some cultural practices, or you have, National Sami Day that you celebrate. But children are not sort of being exposed to a summarized version of the longer narrative of how we have gotten here, and how this is not about celebrating a group that is other, not saying they're still other, but we're now happy about that, but rather, well, how do these groups relate to each other, and how have they been intertwined for, hundreds of years? And it is a difficult thing to do. But at the same time, it's not so difficult that it's not possible. But the will needs to be there to, to make that narrative clear.
Yeah, I think it's like the frustration came across there, because of course we've talked to universities, we've talked to professors and people with degrees and students and so on and so forth, and we fill them in what we think, what we have, which is kind of common known history in itself. Like English, the English came, they colonized, they set up institutions, they set up systems, and we're saying they never switched them off. And that's as simple as history we can give it. Yeah, I think also that the 70s, which is also part of your report. Sorry, you want to say something, Dylan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, when it comes, I was going to say, make a point there about that, is that it's easy to keep repeating it if you don't. It's easy to keep repeating that othering or that problem when the spotlight or the focus is still directed towards that community, if you know what I mean. And what they're very successful about doing, and we had looked at that, Bernard, remember, with the state, the origin of the modern states, modern nation states, which are kind of recent enough concepts in a sense. And the whole point of them creating their own mythology. And one of the mythologies they create is that things have always been the way they are. This, what we now call, for example, in Ireland, the settled community, it's sort of imaginary situation where unconsciously we're taught and we believe that somehow we've always lived the way we live all the way back into the past. And therefore the traveller community as well must have always been there as a minority somewhere within that. And of course, the further we go back, there isn't actually this what we now call settled Irish don't exist. If we go back beyond the 16th century in particular, most of the country is not recognizable. As Bernard says, those labels don't even exist. There's no concept of that, because most of them are still living in a Gaelic world. Now, in that world, whether someone's nomadic or not is not a politically charged thing in the same way, if you know what I mean. And anyway, when the national myths are created, not only is it an eternal kind of everything was the same all the way back. Now we're normal. There's the small community. We're focused on them, and what is most successful at is that the settled community there's no research, there's no need to look at them, and there is no grants available or anything else to research why who are the settled Irish? Why do we call them that even? If you know what I mean. I mean, it says it in a way that if some Irish are settled, then others must not be, and it's a thing in itself that comes from the colonial point of view. And I actually think that you can't kind of deal with that, that the key route into that education is actually looking at the history of all of the communities, including where did settled, how did that develop? where does that culture and mentality come from in Ireland? And you know, it leads you into the history of the Pale and all that, but also into the kind of what colonialism does, how it happened, what choices people make, and then how the divisions that we see now kind of have come about. Yeah, so I think that like part of the focus has to be on even the sociology research and anthropology and things like that. I think it's warrants that it's not, you're not just looking at marginalized communities as if the other communities just doesn't, you don't need to look at that, you know, that kind of way.
And I think that's probably relevant in many parts of the world, like the introspective look on identity. Because as you said, even yeah, if you look at projects that are run and grants, it is looking at the smaller communities, it is looking at the so-called marginalized rather than, well, to be marginalized, there has to be another group that is creating that. And what is that group? And is that really a unified group? And what's the origin of that? Yeah, I feel like that in itself would clear up a lot of the questions that we're trying to address about various groups. If you actually look at the so-called mainstream and look at those origins.
Just
Yeah,
even with nation states, it kind of when I think of nation states, I think of former empires and colonial powers. So if you were in any other part of the world as a nation state, it would be kind of obvious you came with the colonists, that's an English European system. But what gets lost in here in Ireland is that because the people look the same and had adopted the English institutions. In many ways, it's the empire never left, because many of the people who were running the institutions were descendants of the English who didn't switch to Irish. So they became the proud Irish and they had to get rid of us. So we're talking about a kind of almost psychological colonization. We went through the physical part, and we're not even blaming Dublin. We're not saying you are bad people or we have an evil government. We're saying that this is so old and subconscious, most of it, because people, as we mentioned, we believe the things we believe. And if we see it, it becomes our reality and so on and so forth. So in Dublin's perspective, they are Irish and this is reality. But taking a step back from that, you would say, well, your system and your institution is not from the island. It's from England. It's been never switched off, other than changing a few labels here and there. So the maintaining of the traveller labels today can also, like linguistics, you can trace the language and words back. If you do that, even with the genealogists, you go with our surnames have a history. We would say the labels they were put on us have a history. They have an origins. So we have that origin stories where all of these labels in the present have an origin story and they're not from Ireland. But that doesn't mean we kick them out. It means we understand ourselves a bit more and a bit deeper. And as I mentioned, how we're all genetically related. So if we keep going back far enough, we all came from one gene pool and spread out to over time. Is there anything you'd like to add? And I'll ask you a couple more questions if you like, if we're not boring to.
I've got a few more minutes if you have more questions.
Yeah, okay. Well, just say it. When you studied the 19, where did you study it? Well, what college was it again?
I was at Oxford first, and then I moved on to University in Norway.
Oh, Oxford. That's interesting because you've done a couple of papers and they have that kind of travelers in the origins of 1922. Now, in all fairness, in Cambridge University, they've recently written the history of Ireland. So that's kind of a little bit strange for me also that an English institution is writing the history for the people they oppressed in the first place. And I think it is,
It was a very interesting process to go through in an institution which, in many ways, is grappling with its own colonial and racist histories. And actually, I know of various projects or topics that were to some extent shut down because they started to touch on topics that were maybe not the most favorable. Um, and so it was an interesting process to go through. And it was actually, you mentioned, making likenesses with Roma communities and such. I encountered many academics who had not heard of Irish travelers, who assumed I was doing a project about the Roma. So it was, for me, very interesting because having grown up in Ireland, it was such a, of course this is something that exists, of course this is a topic that we talk about, it's a very relevant one. So yeah, it was interesting for me to go through that, and I was quite adamant that I wanted to look at it. And yeah, luckily I had some people who were very fascinated and supported this. But yes, and in a way it's strange coming from an institution like that, and at the same time I was quite happy about it, because it's almost like you're bringing up these topics internally within an institution that actually needs to look at itself and needs to do that introspective reflection that we were talking about. Um, how achievable that is, of course, with just a few people working on these things, I don't know. But um, yeah, I think it was good to bring up this discourse. So yeah, it was an interesting setting for it.
Very good.
That's really interesting, all right. I was just going to say that it's possible with as what Bernard was saying, that the with the backing of some of that science, which often doesn't. I mean, it's a difficult one to get it all. I mean, into the right shape. But the latest, it's true that genetics information, and particularly the biome, gut bacteria kind of implications and things like that for the communities like the Travellers in Ireland and others, actually gives us a, if we mix that with archaeology, and a straightforward narrative, because we haven't changed the history in any radical way. It's just that we can lock it down, so it's no longer a kind of to and fro and kind of, we're not no longer just a dispute about whatever. We can actually lay out a reasonable, straightforward history of how the communities come about and how, like we said, settled Irish, how the state constructs itself and all of that, which is beyond my remit a little bit, but it's all that kind of like how the state creates its big national mythology, and then some people have to be excluded and all that. But I think with science, we can really, with a science pinning it as the story of where the people come from, that it does go back that far, and it goes back to the origin of the Irish state itself. That actually papers and research like your own, then suddenly I think it can start to really help in terms of the getting that education to be recognized as, to get a narrative that there won't be
I
just
think
one narrative.
bringing those together, right? The
Yes.
transdisciplinary side of it,
Yeah.
and also in a way, it's a shame that in order to publish, it does tend to have to be in a very academic arena, which is not so accessible, and also usually not of interest to the general public. But grounding it in science, bringing sociology, anthropology, archaeology into it to try to create a narrative that is understandable to people and is grounded in fact. I mean,
Yeah.
that is what I would see as the goal.
Yeah.
Likewise.
And it gives space too, because we're not telling people, it's not about history, as Bernard, yourself, Bernard, it's not, people get worried sometimes that we're telling a different history or we're telling them what their history is or something like that. But actually you're doing the opposite. You're getting this scientific grounding and a kind of, but it actually, and a narrative that gives enough space though for people to follow through with their own stories, even if it's down to individual levels. Because we have encountered the problem you mentioned, which is that we can't just throw facts entirely at this, because we can have as many facts as we like, and we've encountered it even with academics, that facts don't necessarily matter all that much sometimes when it comes to these stories, and when it comes to power and whether you're right or wrong or whatever, it does come down to things like feelings and that. Yeah.
Yeah, which is it's a difficult pill to swallow sometimes, but I think that the magic does happen when those two sides can come together. Because if you look at it just from a sociology point of view, you can go in a cyclical argument. It's one side against the other. You're not trying to find a solution. You're not really pinpointing anything. And that side is there. It's real. It exists. And then, having those underlying facts and finding a good way to mesh those um, should be the way forward. But again, I think even the separation of subjects at universities, it is also a colonial institution. The way we do education, the way we have to choose our path as we go through, these are all things that are hard to break out of. And it leads everyone down these paths of, an archaeologist shouldn't meet a sociologist who never meets someone who looks at genetics. So we can't sort of align our narratives.
Yeah, there's that eye with the disciplines, and we have that comfort because we get people that dumb down to my level. So I'm grateful for all the academias that do that. On a grand scale, Ireland has, I think, 60% or to up to 80% of depression rate. High on schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, and so on and so forth. And of course, travelers then amplified again. So it is something that we believe is real in the present. It's very relevant because once again, if we remove these labels, we're talking about human experience under the framework of colonization, which is quite old and globally spread. I believe what you see happening in travelers, you will see happening in the USA, you'll see it in Canada, you'll see it in Australia, New Zealand. Why? Because we believe the structures and the institutions are colonial that are creating these patterns, including class systems. Now, we've known we didn't come from there. But yeah, our path is about healing, and sometimes I do get frustrated with our representation. I do not believe the way it is set up that it should still be dominant by members of the settled population, that they're calling the shots. They're deciding which traveller will represent travellers on issues that they clearly have incorrect because we have written history, we have agency, we have experience, we have culture, and we're able to put it together in a way that, as you know, we're finding is kind of shocking people because they never thought of it that way. They were brought up to see the world a different kind of way. And we're saying that we can read the same history books, but we read it differently. So let me ask you, Ina, before we let you go, I hope you got something from this and I haven't ranted all that much. I'll probably have to take out about,
It's
I'll
been
have to
great
take out,
having the conversation.
I'll have to take out about an hour and a half of my ranting and the editing just to make it normal. Uh, but I'm very delighted you did the paper. And I really enjoyed it, and I listened to it several times because I'm not a great reader. My reading has improved a lot with modern technology because I can put on the subtitles or the text, and then I learn. So that's my way. So yeah, formal education is quite recent to me, but it doesn't mean that I didn't have a brain or intelligence growing up. And we sensed these systems, we knew these systems, we thought there was something wrong with the settled people, and then over time, you're told that you're the one that's different, you're the one that's broke, you're the one that's insane, you're the one with issues. And of course, that can manifest and destroy people. And it has. That's why we have such a low life expectancy, because we feel trapped within an environment that people cannot understand us when we try to convey these complex issues. Understandably now, because I didn't know they were so complex till I arrived here. And I had pretty much butchered my way along the way because I was kind of shouting at people, isn't it effing obvious that if we keep doing what the settled people want us to do, we won't be travelers, we'll be settled people. And they can't even tell us who they are themselves. So if they can't do that, what are we being included to? And especially if it has been unchanged from colonial systems. So my question has nothing to do with anything else other than thank you very much for writing the paper, and to all scholars, because it's useful, it's priceful, and it helps us to patch things together, even only for closure and psychological healing. It will be more than we ever had before. So I'm very grateful for you doing your paper, Ina.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to the conversation. And it's great to just hear, some like-minded people having a discussion. And thank you for the work you're doing. I hope you find ways to include more and more people in the conversation, and to get the message out there. And yeah, I'd be really interested to hear more about what you're doing and keep me in the loop.
Absolutely. Look forward to it. Dylan, any final words?
No, that's great. Thanks very much for that. It was interesting, very interesting. I'm interested to see how you get on with how the Sami get on in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
I don't know much about them. I think reindeer are involved, aren't they, in their
Yes,
case? Yeah,
heavily. So yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very much a parallel narrative. So there might be some learning to do actually to compare the two. So
Yeah.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, folks, and appreciate that. And I'll turn this off now.
I know.
Yep. All the best. Bye.